tonight, to introduce our speaker, we have asked his cousin, Shirley Cammack, to make the introduction. Many of you know Mrs. Cammack, and you know her husband, Reverend David Cammack, who has in the past introduced a speaker here. Shirley was born in India, raised there, has served in the, or was a member of the British Foreign Service, and was in Germany at the UN as part of the delegation there, and then shifted gears and became a part of the UN operation and was in Jerusalem, interesting assignment, and has been active in the World Federalists along with David. David Cammack is the president of Maryland's World Federalists. And it's a very, very pleasurable to have Shirley Cammack introduce her cousin, our speaker this evening, Mrs. Cammack.
Thank you so much. It's a delight for me to introduce my cousin Jonathan. He and I were children together. He too was brought up in India, and our first encounter with one another was as children in Gulmarg, which is in Kashmir, one of the most beautiful countries on earth, which is, as you probably know now, a very tragic and war-torn country. But we were very little then, and in fact Jonathan has with him a photograph that I copied for him this morning of us both attending the wedding of our Uncle John, who was colonel of the Gurkha regiment, and he was then a little boy of 4 dressed in a white satin suit, and I was a little girl of 6 dressed in a white satin dress. And it was, he remembers it and so do I. Our families go back, in fact, for many, many years serving India. But at the end of our service to India, when our parents left and when India achieved her independence, my family came back to England, but Jonathan's family moved to what was then Rhodesia. And he went to school in southern Africa, which is just the country south of Rhodesia. Rhodesia is immediately north, for people who aren't familiar with Africa, immediately north of southern Africa. And it was then divided into 2 parts, northern Rhodesia and southern Rhodesia. Jonathan, in the end, was very much involved with northern Rhodesia, which became Zambia. Southern Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Jonathan's schooling was in South Africa, privately educated there, went to South African University, went on to Cambridge, and then later got his PhD in London. He has had an extremely distinguished career. After Cambridge, he joined the colonial service, which to me was an absolutely wonderful service that unfortunately no longer exists because we no longer have any colonies. But I was proud of England's role in her empire, and my family were too. And I was proud of my cousin's role as a colonial administrator, and he then went on to a very distinguished career, which I haven't really got time to go into. After Her Majesty's Overseas Civil Service, he worked for IBM. He was in Zaire for a while. He was in Mauritius for a while. He was in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He was in British Aerospace in Saudi Arabia, in Rio Tinto, which is an enormous mining company. He was in the British Executive Service overseas, training Africans in England to it's an extremely interesting notion that he will probably go into in his talk a little bit. And he is now president of the Royal African Society. So his career has been distinguished, and we have known one another all along and kept in close touch and enjoy a wonderful relationship. He is really as close as a brother to me, and I'm so very proud to introduce my cousin, Jonathan.
Dr. Burd, ladies and gentlemen, it really is a huge pleasure to be here, and gosh, what a wonderful view out there. I feel extremely fortunate, and I just love flags. This sort of occasion is marvelous. It sort of, in a way, reminds me in the old colonial service, which is long dead, but nevertheless, I'm proud of having belonged to it. We used to go off on tour into the bush, and we used to run up the Union Jack outside the tent, and you know, it added something, and I think flags do, and I love the way that Americans fly flags all over the place. You see them all over the place, and that's great. Thank you, Shirley, for the kind words. Yes, I remember that wedding of my uncle, our uncle. I remember thinking that Shirley was the most sophisticated thing I had ever seen. I've thought that all along. But I do remember after the actual speeches, she led me off down into a part of the garden where we sat, and I seem to remember we got up to some badness, but I can't remember exactly what it was, but I do remember from that day, that was the earliest memory I have of Shirley. Anyway, to turn to the business of Africa, over the past few years, I have had the good fortune to visit more than 20 African countries, places like Mozambique, Madagascar, Zambia, Tanzania. We were there about 3 or 4 weeks ago on holiday. And there are plenty of good news stories there to counter the prevailing blanket of gloom and doom about Africa. Nevertheless, I'm very uneasy about the West's approach to Africa. In so many countries, I wonder exactly what is achieved by many of the aid programs or by some of what I've heard called the new colonial masters. These are the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, whose highly visible representatives buzz around in their brand new logo emblazoned 4x4s. On the positive side, so many really heartwarming stories arise from the efforts of individuals to provide what Africa needs more than anything else. That is, help in the form of hands-on skills training provided by volunteers of organizations such as the IESC of the United States, International Executive Service Corps, and Britain's BESO, the British Executive Service Overseas. Experience of the latter in recent years has enabled me to carry on my love affair with Africa, which started in colonial days and has continued right through my career up to the present time. I went to Africa aged 12 when my father moved from India to southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Having had Indian friends and schoolmates, I could never accept the prevailing attitude to race in southern Africa, southern Rhodesia or South Africa, where I went to school and university. In early adulthood, I came to see the need for a strong and positive British role in the region to steer a course, as I saw it then, between what I saw as the extremes of white domination and black nationalism. So, in 1959, I joined Her Majesty's Overseas Civil Service, otherwise known as the Colonial Service. After postgraduate training at Cambridge University, I was sent to northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. There is not enough time to dwell on how things were, but it was a wonderful life. The pay was not good. One was certainly not there for the money. But there was constant interest and variety and lots of early responsibility. We were responsible for coordinating all central government activity. Local government was through the traditional chiefs under the system of indirect rule developed by Lord Lugard in Nigeria and Uganda earlier on in the century. Remember the name Lord Lugard, coming back to that. The great emphasis was on working with people. And of course, I loved the African bush. To be able to do your job, you had to learn the local language. Luckily, I was able to do this fast. A big part of the job was village-to-village touring, and it was marvelous, for instance, to be able to have a laugh with the old ladies as they prepared the evening meal, or chat to the children herding the cattle as you returned from a little walk to try and bag a duck or a partridge. I think we really cared, and there was a lot of trust on both sides. I hope there was a high level of understanding. We were there to prepare the country for self-government. Since we had been there, in Northern Rhodesia that is, for less than 60 years, it seemed to me that we were making good progress in training local staff. Meanwhile, African nationalism was on the ascendancy, partly as a reaction to the federation with Southern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which was imposed on Northern Rhodesia. Blacks in Northern Rhodesia certainly did not want to be dominated by white Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe of today. But politics hardly affected us in the rural areas in 1960. If asked to guess then, I would have said we probably had 15 years before independence. I don't think many African nationalists would have disagreed. The timely Winds of Change speech directed at apartheid South Africa by the then British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan came in early 1960, but there was no subsequent early effort in Northern Rhodesia in terms of accelerating training programs or other preparation for self-rule. Then, all of a sudden, in mid-1963, everything changed. It was a combination: public indifference at home about Britain's role in the world, world hostility, strong anti-colonial sentiments in the United States, and inter-party violence on the Northern Rhodesian Copperbelt, all combined to persuade the British government that it was time to get out fast. Of course, this was dressed up as a very noble act. There were many on the spot that thought it highly irresponsible at the time. Either way, preparation for independence had been woefully inadequate in that in October 1964, when independence came, Zambians ran virtually nothing, either in government or throughout the economy. Furthermore, practice in democracy had hardly taken place, with the very first local government elections held the year of independence itself. Things were bound to go wrong. Nevertheless, these were exciting times, and there were new realities to face. The Zambian national coffers were full, and this gave the new government the opportunity to spend in a big way. For instance, on a secondary school for every district in the country. It all seemed so easy to Zambians. Understandably, Zambians wanted new friends and contacts and were keen to replace British civil servants. In mid-1966, I was still running a wonderful district of 12,000 square miles and 60,000 people with special problems following the flooding of the Kariba Dam, at that stage the biggest man-made lake in the world. I was replaced by an ex-clerk who was most unhappy. He thought that by being sent to the bush, he was missing out on promotion opportunities on the Lusaka gravy train. Of course, Zambians wanted rapid development, jobs, cars, expanded health services, education, naturally. They also wanted higher salaries, and a commission chaired by a left-wing British economist reported that copper miners did not receive a living wage, judging by British standards, I hasten to add. So pay was raised, and this affected the whole economy and Zambia's ability to compete within the region. Meanwhile, the mines, the backbone of the economy, were nationalized, having been very successful and started on a long downhill slide. Other consultants were brought in to advise on all manner of things, including diversification away from dependence on copper. Large sums were spent, for instance, on pineapple schemes, banana schemes, cotton schemes, and on establishing new industries all over the place. Aid offers of all sorts were accepted, including tractors for rural areas where local agriculture had not yet reached the stage of ploughing with oxen. The tractors ended up being used as local taxis and then broke down for lack of spares. In government, despite some remarkable success stories, after meteoric promotion, over-promotion led inevitably to inefficiency and failure. Some promotion arose from the local custom of powerful people dispensing favors to relations or to friends. To outsiders, this looked at best like nepotism, at worst corruption. But there was still plenty of money. So where necessary, a short-term contract expatriate could be brought in to plug gaps where failures had occurred. The effect of all this in terms of long-term wealth creation and diversification was virtually nil. At the same time, the socialist leadership's attitude to enterprise and profits was such that local small-scale traders and marketeers were accused by the ruling party of profiteering and their activities curtailed. Thus was local enterprise, of which there wasn't a strong local tradition, was killed off before it had emerged from the egg. Still, there was so much money swishing around that all this did not seem to matter, and prosperity prevailed until the early 1970s. Then the price of copper fell drastically. Now the country could no longer afford so much foreign expertise, and it became more and more dependent on aid. Having been one of the richest countries in Africa, I think the third richest at independence, within a few years, Zambia was among the poorest. Over the years since then, Zambia, like many other countries in the region, has come to realize that its salvation lies in its own hands. It has stopped blaming everybody but itself for its problems. It has become much more open. It is vigorously tackling corruption. It now encourages enterprise and even welcomes white immigrant farmers from Zimbabwe. It has reprivatized the copper mines and other state enterprises and is now privatizing the infrastructure. So there's a lot of investment possibilities in Zambia now. Zambians, despite all they have been through, are cheerful, friendly, and welcoming, particularly once they learn that more than 30 years ago, you were part of the colonial administration. And I'd like to come back to Lugard, because my wife phoned me just before I flew to Baltimore and said, had I read this, that Lugard had said, getting on for a century ago, 3/4 of a century ago, he said, for 2 or 3 generations, we can show the Negro what we are. Then we shall be asked to go away. Then we shall leave the land to those it belongs to, with the feeling that they have better business friends in us than in any other white men. I was most impressed with that little bit of foresight. To change tack, to the south of Zambia, on the other side of the Zambezi River, is Zimbabwe. From 1922, it had quasi-independence from Britain as Southern Rhodesia. Although technically a colony, it was never a protectorate like Northern Rhodesia. It was a conquered country, settled by whites, run by whites, where a white democracy and white institutions and lifestyle prevailed. Certainly, the paramountcy of African interests, which was the policy in Northern Rhodesia, did not apply. After the Second World War, there was a large-scale influx of skilled British workers or artisans who, enjoying a newfound status and prosperity, were a crucial element in blocking African advancement, which of course threatened their lifestyle. This helped make the new hopeful policy of so-called partnership in the new federation of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland, established in 1953, look like a mockery. Before then, African nationalism virtually did not exist. Partnership should have meant the removal of short-sighted racial slights and pinpricks, such as separate entrances in post offices and public buildings, racially segregated toilets, and a ban on blacks entering restaurants, cinemas, and hotels. Sadly, this did not happen, and the routine denigration of blacks by many whites continued. This situation, which touched on black people's dignity, was not just unnecessary, it was virtually suicidal in the longer term. It contributed greatly to the rapid rise of black nationalism during the 1950s and 60s, and the end of the Federation by 1963. This was sad, as the Federation could have been a multiracial success story and a powerful example of races living together to South Africa, to the south. Meanwhile, the rise of African nationalism caused whites to move further and further to the right. Whites in southern Rhodesia, seeing independence come to northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, demanded it for themselves. Not surprisingly, the British government was not prepared to place the fate of 6 million blacks in the hands of 250,000 whites, even though the country's records of growth and material achievement was very impressive. Whites understandably distrusted British motives and thought that Britain was not interested in their long-term future. There was much talk of a unilateral declaration of independence, UDI, and this duly occurred in November 1965. Britain did not try to intervene militarily, but sponsored worldwide sanctions. The British Prime Minister Harold Wilson clearly misjudged white Rhodesian determination and talked of the rebellion being over in weeks rather than months. 10 years later, by 1975, southern Rhodesia was feeding great swathes of Africa, including Zaire, that is the Congo, where I happened to be working at the time, with vital supplies of meat and maize. Rhodesia, as it now called itself, had built up new industries and developed an impressive level of self-sufficiency with a high level of black cooperation. However, black nationalism was very much alive, and a liberation war really took off about 1976. By 1977, it was everywhere. When I visited my farmer friends in late 1977, a farm I'd been to since from 1952 onwards, just about every year, their house had been attacked with rockets and machine gun fire in the middle of the night, and they were living behind double electrified fences and scatter bombs in the garden and walls built outside every window. Though it might have seemed that their war was unwinnable, the Rhodesian whites continued to think that they had moderate African support. I think they persuaded Margaret Thatcher. She persuaded the warring parties to negotiate in London in 1979 and agreed to send out troops to monitor a ceasefire. It was also agreed that Britain would supervise new elections. I was really thrilled to be asked to go out with the election supervisory team. Having been writing to successive British foreign secretaries to try to persuade them to accept our responsibilities and help stop the dreadful war. The election supervisory team, incidentally, was made up of mainly of retired members of the colonial administrative service, and particularly officers ex-Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, who could relate to the prevailing regional cultures, both black and white. Effectively, it was the last gathering of the colonial service. And I wish things had turned out a bit better for Zimbabwe. Before being deployed to the Zambezi Valley, I witnessed huge crowds of rural people flocking to Salisbury, as Harare was then known, the capital, flocking in their thousands to welcome Robert Mugabe back from exile in Mozambique. It was only necessary to talk to a few of these people to gain the impression that Mugabe and his Patriotic Front ally, Joshua Nkomo, had massive and overwhelming support. The reaction of nearly all whites I spoke to was that it was all just intimidation. For them, such was the horror of the prospect of a Patriotic Front victory that they had somehow persuaded themselves that it was unthinkable. It became clear to me that blacks would vote for the Patriotic Front as the only way of stopping the war. Out there in the Zambezi Valley, it became even clearer that support for Smith and his non-militant nationalist ally, Archbishop Mozorewa, was almost non-existent. What was also clear was that the government was totally out of touch with local people. I asked to visit a village on my first afternoon at Binga, and before I was allowed in, soldiers with guns checked on every hut. When eventually the villagers were assembled, they were too terrified to respond to anything that I had to say. A day or two later, wearing my Union Jack badge, I was allowed into a village on my own. I approached two women. I can remember them. They were picking fruit off a tree, and I said, "Zirarigwa," which means, "Are they edible?" And they said, "Zirarigwa." I said, "Well, amuite bantu kutiba indimvwe." Go and call people so that they can listen to me, because I want to talk to them about peace. Incidentally, this was a language which none of the white Rhodesians spoke, and I spoke it because I'd been in across the river in Zambia for many years. So I told these women that I'd come from Britain and wanted to talk about peace. I asked them to go and call people from the neighboring villages. With the Rhodesian army at a discreet distance, I started speaking to 50 people or so. Within 15 minutes, there were 300, all desperate to hear about peace and the elections, which we would try to ensure were free and fair. I needn't say that I was much moved by my reception. The election took place, I made a lot of friends, and the Patriotic Front was elected. To counter the danger of white panic and a large-scale exodus many whites had threatened, Mugabe made his speech about turning swords into plowshares. Though some whites went south to South Africa, very many stayed. Peace descended almost immediately, and Mugabe had inherited a country with a strong economy and infrastructure, and people weary of war who had every reason to face new realities and get on together. Almost immediately, many thousands of black professionals who had been working or studying abroad came back to help build the new nation and form the rump of a much-needed black middle class. One of the headlines I remember at the time proclaimed that the white farmers who had bravely stayed on through the war were national heroes. My great friends who had been talking of leaving were persuaded of what I had been saying to them all along, that their country needed them. The scene was set for a real African success story. I kept in touch with Zimbabwe by taking my family there in 1981. The next year, my new job involved frequent travel there. We seemed to have the whole lovely country to ourselves. Tourists around the world had yet to catch up with what had happened. There were worrying signs, though, at the time. Mugabe organized a donors' conference and managed to give the impression that he was lukewarm on enterprise and on the encouragement of investment. However, despite being avowedly socialist, even Marxist, he was pragmatic and went round saying to farmers and others, don't bother about what we say, just bother about what we do. And this was the message that he got around. He had the support of many whites, probably the majority of whites. There were other whites, however, who had difficulty understanding how things had changed. They did not appreciate how close they had come to losing everything in the war. And that there was, in my opinion, far too much negative thinking. This undoubtedly irritated the leadership, which felt that its policy of reconciliation was not really appreciated. On the other hand, government did not seem to appreciate what it had inherited in terms of high-level skills, a first-class education system, a strong, diverse economy, and infrastructure, and a multiracial, multicultural population with strong entrepreneurial traditions. There was a basic incompatibility between Mr. Mugabe's socialism and the country's successful, thrusting entrepreneurial culture and traditions, in which all races were now set to share. He was doggedly going one way when all his neighbors were beginning to go in exactly the opposite direction. The government adopted a rather ludicrous "we know best" attitude, but did not tackle the vital land issue on which it had been elected. Though there was money around, provided by various donors, including Britain, and there were empty farms available. At the same time, white farmers could have, perhaps should have, shown more understanding of the looming land problem and helped out the government instead of taking the line that they were untouchable because of their importance to the economy. Now, the land issue has really gone very quickly up to the very, very top of the agenda and has been placed above everything else, partly because Mr. Mugabe did not tackle it a long time ago. The economy, race relations, and the rule of law have been linked to Mugabe's survival in power. The genie has truly been let out of the bottle, and it is going to be very hard to put it back. Confidence has disappeared, tourism has dried up, terrible uncertainty prevails, and there is even the prospect of economic collapse in Zimbabwe, of all places. What I find particularly sad is that a country which went through so much to achieve peace and tolerance is being allowed to slide backwards towards conflict and hatred. I was in Zimbabwe in May and spent a few days with my friends on a white-owned farm and witnessed the intimidation and fear which is really palpable. sending in untrained people to help themselves to highly productive land, contrary to the law, surely adds up to national suicide or an attempt at national suicide. But all is not lost. I did not meet a single person in Zimbabwe, from the caddy on the golf course to the taxi driver to the middle-class black businessmen to some top black businessmen, everybody. I didn't meet anybody who approved of what Mr. Mugabe is doing. The situation was reflected, this situation was reflected in the recent elections when the ruling party failed to win even one seat in any of the 4 cities, not one seat. There is a palpable yearning for change, which is particularly strong amongst middle-class professional blacks. Bear in mind, too, the country's great resilience and the commitment of its citizens of all races. Democracy is now well entrenched, and the people will not lightly throw away the hard-earned peace they achieved 20 years ago. Also bear in mind that the elections were well run, and despite the intimidation produced a real opposition for the first time since independence. Not everybody realizes that the press in Zimbabwe is free and highly critical. The government organ, the main, what had been the main government newspaper, you see it standing in great piles on the sidewalk. Nobody wants to buy it. Whereas the critical journals, newspapers, sell like absolute hot cakes. I am optimistic that the people of this very special country can be relied on to come together to sort out their own problems. I think this is the main hope for the future. We sometimes wonder why more pressure is not put on Zimbabwe by other parts of Africa, particularly South Africa. Bear in mind the very strong desire to stick together and not criticize each other developed over the Cold War years when both East and West were trying to pressurize Africa. African countries are aware of the complexity of each other's problems and of the difficulties of understanding them. The outside world is right to take an interest and show concern. However, Africans are acutely sensitive to criticism, especially as they know that in the past, so much of that criticism has arisen from prejudice, preconception, and plain ignorance. I must mention South Africa, 6 years after the miracle of a peaceful transfer of power to the black majority. In my opinion, it's still early days, but progress has been good, particularly in sustaining and developing democracy and linking in to the global economy. Many problems, however, remain, mainly the legacy of apartheid. I think South Africans as a whole are well aware of these problems. I don't think that they are sufficiently aware that the experience of other African countries over the last 40 or so years could help in solving some of these problems, or indeed how important the relationship is with the rest of Africa is for both sides. Clearly, the South African economic powerhouse has the potential to be the engine of growth and prosperity for the continent, especially if allied to a democratic and prosperous Nigeria, the other continental giant which has recently rediscovered democracy. So, whither Africa in the 21st century, and what are its problems and needs? Few people outside Africa understand quite how much progress has in fact been made, considering the negligible preparation for self-rule and democracy, which I mentioned earlier on. The outside world also needs to appreciate that there is a new class of entrepreneurs, administrators, managers, and decision makers, but they are in very, very short supply, and they could not have been expected just to arise out of a newly independent country just like that. There is a priority need for education and training. There have been, of course, massive barriers to the development of effective local management and leadership capable of taking a grip on a country's needs. These barriers arise not just from the lack of sufficient educated and trained people, but also from the aftermath of a dependent role, which leads to self-stereotyping and a lack of genuine self-confidence. To make real progress, Africans need to break out of this mindset. Now that the high initial expectations of freedom and independence have been dashed, there is the chance to take stock and face reality. This is truly daunting and now includes the terrible scourge of AIDS. For years, a major factor has been the destructive power of misplaced guilt. Westerners have felt that they could best right the wrongs of the past and at the same time make themselves feel better simply by putting their hands in their pockets. Often this has led not only to corruption, but has encouraged Africans to think that their salvation lay in the hands of others rather than their own. Furthermore, much aid has been technically inappropriate to local circumstances, and some of it has actually destroyed local jobs and industry. For instance, well-meant gifts of clothes which have knocked out fragile local textile industries, and a gift of wheat which did the same for farmers who were just starting to grow the crop. Now, it seems to me, having created a lot of aid junkies, there is the chance of Western disillusionment over Africa, leading to the abandonment of a continent whose needs it still does not really understand. I think that the world needs to realize not only how important Africa is, both in terms of its human and natural resources, its unique environment, but also in terms of its potential. We need to appreciate that Africa has huge strengths, which in the medium and long term must surely ensure success. Africans are fast learners and highly adaptable. The progress made by many men and women in international organizations or multinational companies, for instance, over the past 20 years or so, has been truly remarkable. African cultural strengths include resilience, self-sufficiency, and an emphasis on community. Along with these go wonderful social skills, including warmth, hospitality, and generosity. At the same time, Africans show an impressive ability to put up with the uncertainties and deprivations with which they are often faced. Yet Africans, though nominally free, are not yet masters of their own destiny. Priorities for Africa are being decided by people who apply their own value systems to people and countries they do not understand. Surely to be free and to make the progress of which it is capable, Africa needs to take its own decisions for which it must be accountable, to find solutions which are compatible with its own cultures, values, and strengths. This implies an overriding need for effective leaders and managers in all sectors. Surely the main thrust of the aid effort should be directed at helping to develop such people. Anything else implies continuing debilitating dependency in many parts of Africa. To put it another way, the help Africa needs is essentially in helping itself and discovering itself. This can only happen if it is brought into the real world on the same terms that are applied to everyone else. Therefore, in my opinion, there is no soft option. The risk of continuing dependency will only be overcome if what is applied to Africa is not condescendingly watered down. But let us be aware that Africa as a whole is making progress. Dogmatic socialism has been abandoned virtually everywhere, and democracy has taken hold in many countries. Moreover, corruption is being faced up to and tackled in many countries. Another major factor is that if African countries are to attain modernity and be able to compete, they must maximize learning opportunities through more contact with the rest of the world and with each other. They must lose their fear of exploitation or domination or of losing local jobs to outsiders. At the same time, they need reassurance that they are quite capable of competing and succeeding. Hopefully, they will gain the confidence to appreciate that placing a protective cocoon around themselves will only hold them back. They should remind themselves that whereas they stand to learn from others, others stand to learn from them. They can only gain from opening all the doors to investors, visitors, tourists, and even to people who want to live in their countries. Clearly, Western and other aid has not achieved the prosperity which was intended, and a rethink of objectives, priorities, and methodology is well overdue. Though the approach represented by IESC and BISO and similar organizations is the right one, the help they provide is only a drop in the ocean. It is clear to me that a massive program of education and training for Africa is overdue. It should be given a high priority by all developed countries, preferably acting in concert. This means consultations, including governments, aid agencies, academics, businesses, the World Bank, and the IMF. The emphasis should be on postgraduate education and training, skills training, and work experience to help Africa catch up and fulfill her true potential. A scheme I developed and ran from 1982 to 1993 for the world's leading mining company, Rio Tinto, for the benefit of the mining company as a whole, the mining industry as a whole in southern Africa, taught me that great things can be achieved in a short time through work attachments in another cultural context. This enables people to escape from the inherited strictures and inhibitions related to race or role within their own cultural situation. These are often a block to self-realization at home and have to be overcome. The scheme also showed me how much untapped leadership and management potential exists in Africa. Work contact with people at work, getting to know them in the work situation, and the chance to succeed, sometimes to fail, and gain acceptance in another culture provides learning experiences which cannot be matched in any other way. Not only do people get the chance to gain strengths from the second culture, but they also gain positive perspectives on their own culture, which they may have been told was no good to the modern world. Every person should be proud of his or her culture. Learning from within in this way allows people to gain important technical know-how and at the same time to compare themselves with the best. The result in terms of confidence building, I can assure you, is transformational. I gained the cooperation of 30 companies in Europe for our scheme, and a similar scheme should not be difficult to reproduce on a bigger scale involving more countries. There is no reason to wring our hands over Africa. Although the continent has not been helped by ignorance and misplaced emphasis on the sort of help that is needed. Africa needs friends, and Africans are very friendly people. My contact with the continent has taught me that feelings towards Britain are particularly warm, and we are seen as understanding Africa. I wish I could be sure that the latter situation was in fact true. I fear that all too often our preoccupations in Great Britain are with narrower or more parochial interests. Africa also needs the continuing interest and understanding of people in the developed world as a whole, including the United States. This is precisely what the Royal African Society works for. We publish an influential quarterly called African Affairs and represent a very wide spread of interests and experience, academics, business, NGOs, diplomats, churches, etc. We have some American members and would welcome more. For those who may be interested in joining the Royal African Society, I have plenty of brochures which combine basic information with an application form. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you enormously for a wonderful analysis and for a display of genuine interest and affection for the continent of Africa and its peoples. The floor is now open for questions. Would you tell us something about the Royal African Society?
The Royal African Society is not political, it's not business, it has no particular line that it plugs. It works for interest in and understanding of sub-Saharan Africa as a whole.
Would you assess the impact of American foreign policy on Africa during the past 8 years?
Yeah, I'm not sure that really I'm familiar enough with U.S. foreign policy on Africa to be able to be as precise as that. I know that the United States has done some very good things in Africa. I think probably as much as other developed countries, the United States has sometimes been misguided in its aid policies. But I've seen U.S. aid in operating in places like Zambia and Malawi. I've seen the Peace Corps people there. I think that the United States has probably not taken as much of an interest in Africa as I would like it to have, and I'm very hopeful that this situation is changing. I get the impression that it is. There's actually an article on a very recent edition of African Affairs which implies that the United States is now getting more tuned in to the real needs of Africa.
Would you comment upon the role of higher education in Africa and the potential role for Westerners?
I can tell you what I've seen in African countries. A higher education is obviously very, very important, and there are some very significant seats of learning and universities in the parts of Africa that I know. I would personally like to see a much greater effort being made by developing countries, particularly in the area of postgraduate education. I said that earlier. It's obviously of vital importance. The problem is that it of course is linked to economic success, and when you have civil strife or economic failure, or your economy is going downhill, a country cannot afford the sort of educational system that it really needs. And this is an area where I think the Western world can help a lot in the provision of education, particularly, as I say, higher education, postgraduate education. We used in Britain to have a lot more African students coming, and it was a very something that built up a lot of understanding between Britain and a number of African countries, and we'd have nowhere near as many coming now as we used to, and I'd like to see that situation restored, personally.
Would you comment upon your view of how you indeed do empower Africans and encourage them to drive their own future?
You know, you're not going to get Africans rising to the top of companies in Zambia or Malawi if the companies are not willing to invest there. So the whole thing is linked to economic development, investment opportunities, people setting up businesses, either foreign or local, or the two together, to give people the opportunity. Now, the fact is that to get an American to go and live in Malawi, he's just not, or she is not going to go there unless you pay him or her an awful lot of money. And therefore, it is not only in the interests of the country, but it is also much more economic if a local person can gain the experience to be able to fill the post. And therefore, localization is very, very important. As long as people are not just put into positions which they're not capable of fulfilling, which happened in Zambia, for instance, in a big way in the years after independence. And it's one of the reasons why the economy went down so fast. But what I'm really saying is that in my experience, what I've seen, given the education and the opportunities, there is nothing to prevent Africans from climbing very fast and taking these positions themselves and being the main players. But I mean, one doesn't get from A, where we are, to B, where we want to go, in one great leap. It's got to be a matter of working towards what I'm suggesting.
Well, certainly your experience and your wisdom and understanding is unique. It's something which we appreciate you sharing with us, and also for showing us in a way, I think, the spirit of a long tradition of good-spiritedness toward the continent of Africa, which you obviously hold, and many of your colleagues as well, is always, I think, a healthy thing for all of us. So for all of those things, we thank you very, very much.
Thank you.